Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. We talk a lot about history on this program. We think it's worth trying to find the context behind the stories of the day. But it's important to note that there is no just one history. History is political. It's debatable. There are always different versions of it, and it can be used to galvanize the people, and it can be used to justify actions that are just straight illegal. Today we're going to be in conversation about history and how it's being used in the war in Ukraine. My guest for this conversation is Ronald Suny. Ronald Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He is the author of the book Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment. Previously, he published Stalin, Passage to Revolution, and back in 2015, he also published the book They Can Live in the Desert, but Nowhere Else, a history of the Armenian Genocide. Ronald Suny joins me over Zoom from Michigan. Professor Suny, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
My pleasure as well, Mitch.
You heard my introduction there. It was an interview, to give credit where credit is due, that I read that you gave to Professor Wang Cole, somebody we respect a lot on this show, on his very important website, Informed Comment. It was an interview that you gave with him that made me start thinking about history and how history is being used. You said something to the extent of truth. You know, there's a saying that truth is the first casualty of war, but you also point out oftentimes what's also left out is a casualty in war as well. Just broadly speaking, and Putin last week gave a very long speech going through the history of Russia and Ukraine, in part to justify the invasion of Ukraine. How do you think history is being used at this moment with the invasion of Ukraine?
Or misused is probably more correct. You know, basically, Mitch, the world changed on the morning of February 24th this year. Something terrible happened. Putin decided to invade his neighbor, Ukraine, unprovoked, frustrated perhaps, overly emotional, but he committed his troops to try to change the regime in Kiev. And we're now in a state of disastrous war. And that, of course, is the background to our discussion, right? Putin himself, before the war, made various, I would say, accusatory statements in his histories, that these kind of potted histories that someone, I think, must have written for him about the history of Ukraine and Russia. And he argued in those histories in a kind of self-serving way to justify ultimately what he was about to do. And I must say, I did not anticipate in any way that he would go so far as to actually launch this invasion. He used the history as a kind of weapon. And that often happens, right? I mean, history is what you might call a subversive science, because it undermines the convenient, comfortable myths and so-called truths that various leaders or pundits or propagandists believe about the past to justify their actions in the present. And what historians do, which is try through assiduous, lonely work in archives and original sources and contrasting views, as you mentioned, is try to set the record straight in some way. We understand as historians that we're not completely objective. We're not completely neutral. As Karl Marx said, who educated the educator, right? We were educated somewhere. He didn't come from outer space. I was raised in the United States. I have American values to a large degree, but you try, and that's your task as a historian, to be as objective, fair, balanced, and neutral as possible, right? So that's as close as we get to objectivity. And one of the things that happens in the historical profession is dispute and debates about the various views. So that's where we're at. And we've been presented with this relatively, I would say, tendentious, often in places falsified history by Putin, that in fact tries to argue that Ukrainians and the Russians are one people. Now, I have no objection to that. That is, there's ways in which both Ukraine, Russia, and you could add Belarus in there, were early Slavic peoples who lived in something called Rus or Kievan Rus, we're talking about the early and Middle Ages, that eventually separated into different linguistic and cultural groups over time. But in no way does that affinity, those associations of those peoples through centuries, justify anything like warfare or conquest. Putin knows perfectly well that whatever the relations and similarities and familiarities between Ukrainians and Russians, Ukrainians are a different nation. They have different ideas of who they are. And by the way, the major operative thought in Ukrainian nationalism is a kind of hostility and difference with Russia. That's how Ukrainians have largely defined themselves over time. But Putin, like a great Russian imperialist in a way, and this was indeed the view of the Tsarist governments and Tsarist conservatives 100 and some years ago, has a different view that, those Ukrainians, we call them Malorossianie. They're little Russians. So we got great Russians, those are what we call Russians, little Russians, those are what we call Ukrainians, and Belarusians, white Russians. So this view, this imperial figure, then seems to be the one that Putin is using to justify the kinds of actions he's taken.
You mentioned Kievan Rus. At one time, Kiev was the center of a very old Russia. When does the split between Russia and I guess Ukraine occur?
I don't want to advertise all of my books, but my good close colleague Valerie Kivelson and I wrote a book published a few years ago called Russia's Empires. And Val is a distinguished historian of early modern, what some people would call medieval Russia. And as we worked out what we were thinking about the earliest stages of this history that we were writing, and we dealt with the centuries, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries in this history, we dealt with what's called Kievan Rus. And this was a bizarre, kind of strange constellation of warriors, cities, armies, Vikings, Slavs, all kinds of different things going on in what we concluded was not even a state, right? But roving princes, some of whom declared themselves kings, often killing their neighbors and killing their own sons in order to establish power. At one point, one great warrior king seized the city of Kiev, the largest in the area, conquered it, and then burned it to the ground and wandered off to another city. So this was what Rus was. We would not call it a state, but rather maybe a kind of constellation. But what is important about Rus are two things. One king, Volodymyr the Great, or Vladimir the Great, converted his kingdom by accepting Orthodox Christianity, right? Allied to the Byzantine Empire.
This is through marriage.
Through marriage and through his own conversion, right? And that conversion in the mythologies that exist occurred in Crimea. So that is also one of the things that is used by the Russians to say, look, Crimea is our birthplace. We also are here. Now, the second point, besides the conversion to Christianity and then the molding of these people, these Rus, at the time as a Christian nation, Orthodox Christian nation, the second important thing is that this idea of Kievan Rus is used as the origin point, not only for Russian history and who Russians are, but for Ukrainians and who Ukrainians are. In other words, two nations are trying to use this complex early history as their origin point. And in nationalism, one always goes backward to the primordial, primeval, earliest times to show we were here. And we have a continuous history. That's a complete myth all the way up to the present, right? I mean, if you think about France and Germany, a lot of people don't know this. They both claim Charlemagne, the great first Holy Roman Empire, as their progenitor, right? Well, okay, but we know France and Germany are two completely different nations.
And it also is really interesting. I don't mean to get too off topic here, but at the same period of time, this conversion to Orthodox Christianity is also right around the time we get the Cyrillic alphabet in the creation in order, because you needed, it didn't have the language at the time, didn't have, my understanding, you'll correct me on this, but my understanding is the language at the time did not have an alphabet, and this conversion of Christianity had all these documents, and you needed to be able to write these in a language that the people could understand.
The most important thing was to translate the Bible into some kind of vernacular or some kind of language that could be read by those few who could read, and then propagate that faith through the church, which was established at some point in that medieval period. Yeah.
And again, it's just very interesting to me because you see a very similar dynamic that happens in Western Europe as well as you do see in Eastern Europe, and that is just this invasion from people from Scandinavia, from the north, the Vikings coming in. I mean, that's who the Rus were.
You got it right, actually. So in the earliest chronicles, again, we don't know how much of this is actually true, how much is it founding myths that then get propagated. And, through Russian history, there have been all kinds of debates within Russia and with other scholars about this Norman theory. I mean, who were these people who came down, the Rus? They were, according to the chronicles, invited in from outside. And those Rurikids, as they were called, eventually become the ruling dynasty, and others, when the center of Russian history moves from this western area of Kiev toward Moscow and Muscovy, as that becomes really a state, they'll claim this descent, this origin within the Rurikids, right? And that will be one of the justifications of the authority of some princes, usually the mightiest warriors, right? And you have in early states, I don't call these nations yet, but you have in early states and these conglomerate of peoples that are in that state, like early Moscow. You have then a church, okay? You've got some kinds of shared languages, probably lots of dialects and different vernaculars going on. You have loyalty to the dynasts, the great prince of Moscow, eventually the Tsar under Ivan the Terrible, right? You have those kinds of things. But you also need mythologies. You also need some things, at least, that the ruling elite can appeal to and maybe propagate outward to the people in order to keep them loyal to the authorities that are ruling them.
Yeah. When do we start to see the formation of what we call nationalities, or at least identities that we'd start to recognize as being Russian and as being Ukrainian?
That's a controversial subject, right? So there will be nationalist historians who will drive that back as far as you can go, maybe to Kiev or whatever. Certainly, there are differences already that one can note between Moscow and what is becoming Russia, Muscovite Rus, and those powers and those dynasts that are existing in the West, what we would call Ukraine today, right? And Ukraine is fought over, and it at certain times falls under the Poles. At certain times, as in 1654, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, one of the great leaders of this area, appeals to Moscow and wants to join Moscow and be protected by the Tsar, right? There are other periods when other dynasts, let's say Mazepa or someone later, will want to be independent of Moscow. So there are Cossack traditions in Ukraine that also are somewhat independent. Cossacks are basically peasants who flee from their masters into the peripheries of the empire, into the border lands, and they become a kind of ethnic group on their own, right, with their own traditions, etc. So things are separating. But when do we say there's really a nation? And that's also disputed, right? Some people call any group of people that has language, some sense of themselves, what I would call ethnicity or something like that, as a nation. But the way we use the word nation today in modern parlance, when you actually kind of deconstruct it, I would define it as something like this. A nation is a group of people that believes or imagines that it is harmonious and homogeneous within, distinct from others, shares a culture, that could be religion, that could be ethnicity, that could be myths, that could be language, often it's language. And that group of people with that culture believes that as a prerequisite of that culture, as deriving from that culture, they have the right to rule themselves, right? Perhaps to form a state or gain some autonomy, some political recognition, and add to this, can lay claim to a piece of the world's real estate. That is a territory, that is their homeland. So in the modern notion of nation, it's a culture, however defined, often ethnically, but in America or Switzerland, it's defined civically as belonging to certain values. That culture gives you the right to political representation and eventually sovereignty. And you can see that within nation, that what I call the discourse of the nation, the way we think about nations from the late 18th century to the present, there's already implied, not always enforced, a notion of popular sovereignty, that the people constituting the nation have the right to rule themselves. So that idea would already be, you can find it, and it's propagated in the late 18th century in Europe, in many parts, in France and elsewhere. There are people in Poland who will argue in this way, usually that it's the nobles who are the nation. There are Greeks and Irishmen who begin in the early 19th, late 18th and early 19th century to talk about the nation. The French Revolution is very important in terms of talking about the nation having political rights and all the rest of it. And then in the 19th century, of course, as well, Ukrainians, intellectuals, Taras Shevchenko and others, poets and writers, begin to articulate that, you know what, we're also a nation. And then everybody gets on the kind of nation bandwagon and begins to propagate it. And they define themselves. Many Ukrainian nationalists define themselves, as I mentioned before, particularly as different from Russia, which Russia, of course, fights against. The Tsarist government will never recognize that Ukraine is a nation, and it will try to suppress the Ukrainian language even, right? I can mention two more things. One that's interesting is that Russians always have a trouble defining themselves as a nation. So there's Ukrainians, which are trying to define themselves as a nation, and they're a big country, lots of dialects and all the rest of it, lots of Russians living within them and so forth, under an empire, right? But the Russians are also having trouble. They're an empire. They're a multinational people, and they're looking for some definition of their own of what makes a nation. And by the way, that's still a problem in Russia today, trying to define who they are as a nation, not an empire, right? That's a difficulty. But I want to mention one more interesting thing that people leave out of this history. When do Ukrainians really become a nation, not only as an expression of certain nationalist poets, politicians, statesmen, etc.? When do masses of Ukrainians, the peasantry, and it's largely a peasant nation well into the 20th century, when do they feel they're part of this nation? And you know when that happens? And here's the irony. Under the Soviet Union. Under a very strange federal, pseudo-federal, I would say, empire, and I do call the Soviet Union an empire, in which Lenin and the Bolsheviks recognized, and by the way, Putin mentions this in his history, though for his own purposes, that Lenin and the Bolsheviks form a Ukraine, a Soviet Republic of Ukraine, and then begin, particularly in the 1920s, to propagate and foster Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, literature, etc. Later, in the 30s, Stalin will work in a different direction. He'll push more Russification. He'll never get rid of Ukraine or certain kinds of Ukrainian language in schools and all the rest, Ukrainian film studios and whatever. But there's a shift towards Sovietization or Stalinization and Russification later on. So there's always a conflict and a tension in Ukraine and many other republics between this nationalization tendency and this Sovietization tendency. We're all Soviet people. We're all members of the same nation. And people can move anywhere in this large empire, etc. So those are very important. That is, ironically, in the Soviet Union, that Ukraine becomes in some way a full-fledged nation that people identify with, fights through Second World War, and so forth. And by the way, the Ukrainian state, that is, a state is different from a nation in my understanding, the state, the unit itself, is eventually put together by the Leninist government that puts pieces together like the Donbass and so forth into Ukraine, and by Stalin. Stalin, after World War II, takes what had been between the wars, parts of Poland, and brings it into Ukraine and makes the kind of Ukraine you see today. And you might add one more thing to that. The last little chunk to go into Ukraine is Crimea. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, head of the Communist Party, gave Crimea to Ukraine as a gift to mark the 300th anniversary, as I mentioned, of 1654, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky put himself under the authority of the Tsar. So that is, in quick account, the kind of history and how Ukraine was formed. The end result is Ukraine is, of course, a nation. It's a bunch of people who, by shared culture, think of themselves as a nation, want to be sovereign, want to, in this case, want to be democratic, and are often very hostile to Russia.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Ronald Suny. He is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He specializes in Russian history, and we are talking about the history of both Ukraine and Russia, and also the things that are being said justifying the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That whole history you just laid out in the 20th century, starting with Vladimir Lenin, I think this is around 1919, just after the Russian Revolution. Starting there, going on, is what Vladimir Putin was actually complaining about in his speech last week, and saying this was, we have 100 years of errors of Russia approach to Ukraine. What was Lenin trying to achieve by creating? What did it mean to have a state within the Soviet Union? And was he also doing these with other what would become satellites of the Soviet Union?
So Lenin had a very interesting and I think unrecognized nationality policy. And before the revolution, he didn't want national units to be the part of the post-revolutionary socialist Russia. He was against federalism, and he was against what we might call national cultural autonomy. But sometime after they took power in October 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw what was going on. The country was fragmenting. Ukraine, Finland, and others were declaring themselves independent. And so he readjusted his policy, and he said, I'm going to recognize these national units, because Ukraine had been declared independent by another government, by a bunch of nationalists and socialists, actually, called the Rada. And then again was promoted, this independence was promoted by foreign powers like the Germans, right? So this was happening. So he then moved toward, we're going to make a federal state. And we're going to have, and this would be the first time in history this has ever happened, units that are nationally, culturally separate from one another. And they'll be brought in voluntarily, but, the Red Army was around as well, right? They'll join together. And by 1922, we're just about to mark the 100th anniversary of this, the formation of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the first state in the world organized on the basis of ethnically different, cultural, national, autonomous, so-called, units of this federation. Well, we know how that worked out. Over time, the federation and the units lost power. Stalin, after Lenin's death particularly, Stalin centralized the state. What might have been a federation became what I would call a pseudo-federation, a kind of empire of these different states: Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Belarus, the Russian Federation, which was multinational, and eventually units in Central Asia as well: Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. So that became the Soviet Union.
That's very interesting. So the Soviet Union didn't begin as this powerful centralized authority that it would later become known for. One of the problems with that unit was Lenin was more interested in
in letting these units be more independent, decide things on themselves. But Stalin was a centralizer. He was always about a powerful state. He was what you could call an etatist, a statist. And by the way, Putin is an etatist, not a populist. I think he's a pseudo-nationalist. We can debate that, but he's definitely an etatist, all right? And Stalin wanted order, discipline, no people in the streets unless he called them out. Putin likes those kinds of things as well. And this federation did always, right to the end, recognize the cultural and linguistic rights of these various units. They never abolished them, and they continued. And the irony, and this is what really irks Putin, is that Lenin's nationality policy even gave these units the right to secede from the union. Now, no one thought that was really possible because in each of these units, there was a communist party ruling, which was part of the all-union Communist Party. So, that who thought that fiction of this sovereignty, because all real power was in Moscow, ultimately, who thought that right that Stalin even put in his constitution in 1936 would ever be exercised? But then under Gorbachev, of course, Gorbachev began to democratize the Soviet Union. He gave more and more independence and autonomy to the various units. And before you knew it, they went their own way. As the center weakened, as Gorbachev lost control, and eventually after a coup against Gorbachev, these states fled what was then the sinking ship of the Soviet Union.
Including Ukraine.
Absolutely. Ukraine may have been the most important because it was one of the largest. It was very close to Russia. It was important industrially, agriculturally. And once the Ukrainians decided to leave, then in some ways, and this very good historian at Harvard, Serhiy Plokhy, has written a very good book about the end of the Soviet Union and how this defection of Ukraine led to the fall. It's ironic because just months earlier, in 1991, before the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians voted to stay within the Soviet Union. But after the coup and so forth, Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus. They had a nice drunken holiday somewhere in Belarus, and they dissolved the Soviet Union. 3 men decided to dissolve the Soviet Union, where Ukraine no longer seemed to want to be in the Soviet Union, and they voted overwhelmingly after that for their independence. So, in some ways, the fall of the Soviet Union, which some people see as the result of bottom-up nationalism, and there was some of that, was largely carried out from the top down. You could say that Gorbachev and then Yeltsin allowed the Soviet Union to commit suicide.
There is an argument that you can even find here in the United States that also looks at the West's role in the tension that is occurring now in Eastern Europe, and specifically the expansion of NATO, and NATO, that this expansion provoking Russia and playing a role in helping create the dynamic that would lead to this invasion of Ukraine. What are your thoughts about that?
Basically, I see 2 great narratives, 2 visions of Putin, Russia, that exist in the West, particularly in the United States. So on one, the most dominant one is that Russia is, by its very essence, an expansionist state, an empire that lost out in 1991 and that Putin wants to restore, maybe even rebuild the Soviet Union. And therefore, if it is that kind of state, and if Putin is a kind of empire builder, a kind of neo-Hitler, and you hear this in much of the media, or even President Biden in his talk right after the invasion said, this is clearly an empire builder and so forth. When you, in that vision, there's no room for compromise or negotiation. Because if Putin is Hitler, if he's a new empire builder, if his invasion of Ukraine is basically about rebuilding the Soviet Union, destroying the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, if that's true, and that becomes a powerful argument, particularly after the invasion, right? It will dominate now for quite a time. Then negotiation, concessions, compromise is impossible. And Biden will look like Neville Chamberlain. And the Republicans are already accusing the president of appeasement. They use that word, right? And you can't compromise with someone like that, if that's true. But there is a second narrative. And the second narrative is one that I also subscribe to and wrote about before the invasion, because I did not really think, and I'll admit I was wrong, that Putin would ever go as far as he's gone and invade Ukraine. And that second narrative is that, no, there are genuine security concerns of the Russians. They are a little bit fearful. They're a weak state. They spend about 8% of what the United States spends on defense. NATO is 20 times as much spending on defense as Putin. So they face, great powers and great hostility. And NATO, the United States particularly, but NATO as well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had to think about what its purpose was. How are we going to rebuild the world order? And remember, George H.W. Bush used to talk about a new world order. And what will be Russia's role in that order? And Russia was interested in maybe even joining NATO. There was some loose discussion about that. But in time, NATO decided, NATO, by the way, had been formed as an anti-Soviet pact, right? To prevent the spread of Soviet power and communism and so forth in 1949. And so NATO was looking for a role after 1991, and people even were talking about disbanding NATO. So NATO found its role, and under the Clinton administration and subsequent administrations, they began allowing countries in Europe that had been in the Warsaw Pact, that is the pro-Soviet pact, standing up to NATO, into NATO. And Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary and so forth, Romania, all these countries that had once been Soviet satellites were now in the Western Bloc. And eventually, in 2004, they even allowed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been internal republics of the Soviet Union and on the border of Russia, into NATO, right? So NATO has become, and if you look at the map, it's a huge armed bloc, which Russia sees as an enemy of theirs and a danger to them. NATO says, no, we're a benign alliance. We are a collective security group, protecting ourselves defensively and keeping conflicts from our members, France and Germany, who had two wars in the 20th century, or Greece and Turkey, who are always hostile to one another, from fighting each other. We're not threatening Russia. And Putin doesn't believe that. So the expansion of NATO, which George Kennan, the great intellectual diplomat, theorist of and author of Containment,
sort of seen as the founder of the policy of containment of the USSR, who became critical towards the end of his life of U.S. policy towards USSR.
Exactly right. He was against the expansion of NATO. And many people, even Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, or Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State under Nixon, and so on, these people also were worried about this. But Clinton did push the movement. Yeltsin protested. He was president in the 90s in Russia, but to no avail. And Putin has repeatedly protested. But it's not only NATO expansion, which Russia sees as a threat. It's that the West has placed, the United States has placed rockets in Romania and Poland, and says those rockets are defensive. They are about intercepting missiles from Iran, not aimed at the Soviet Union, not aimed at Russia. Of course, Putin doesn't believe that. And even the New York Times recently revealed that with some switches in software, they could have those rocket launchers aimed at Russia, which would be minutes away. Those rockets would be minutes away from Moscow. And Putin has talked about this. He calls them Tomahawk. They're Tomahawk missiles. So that was a second thing that Putin has brought up repeatedly. This is his view that I'm mentioning. And the third thing was that all through the Cold War, we had very effective treaties to restrain, limit nuclear arms. One of the most important was the so-called ABM Treaty that was negotiated in the 70s during the period of Entente when Nixon and Brezhnev were around. And the ABM anti-ballistic missile treaty was one that you don't build protective missiles that will prevent the other side from launching their attack. In other words, because both sides are nuclear armed, neither has an interest to hit the other. We abrogated that ABM treaty, right? We abrogated it unilaterally. And then under Trump, we abrogated the INF treaty for intermediate range missiles, again, against protests of Russia. And we claimed, and I have no knowledge of whether this was right or wrong, that Russia was breaking that treaty. So the Trumpists then broke that treaty. There's only one nuclear limitation treaty, the so-called New START, that still is in existence. And that's coming up for consideration in a few years. So all of these things, Russia being a relatively weak state, the advancement, expansion of NATO, the abrogation of these protective treaties, the rockets in Eastern Europe, all of those things are seen by Putin as threats to the existence of Russia. And he took the most drastic means. He was frustrated after 20 years in power and no real response except expansion by the West. He took the most drastic means of negotiation. And what's that? He put a gun to the head of the West and said, here are my terms. And the West didn't blink. The West didn't, and particularly the United States, did not make significant concessions. Macron tried to bring everyone to the table over these so-called Minsk II agreements that would have, federalized and neutralized Ukraine. But the West didn't really give in. NATO didn't give in. And Putin then pulled that trigger and launched this disastrous, blunderous, mistaken invasion.
Ronald Suny has been our guest. Ronald Suny is a professor of history and political science at the University of Michigan. He's the author of a number of books, including Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment, and also They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else, a history of the Armenian Genocide. Professor Suny, that was very informative, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join us today.
And I thank you, Mitch, for a really good discussion. You're one of the few interviews that lets you actually lay out some complex ideas at length. Thanks.